That's a tough talk to follow. That was amazing, and I think there were so many overlaps in the way that we look at things as well. And the business world is crazy right now. We all see it. There's just so much going on every day, all day. And what we would like to talk to you about today is really the age of employment, addressing the aging workforce. And the world's biggest problems are the world's biggest market opportunities. I think that's a really important point to think about today as we talk, because there's so many things within this discussion that can happen, and how can we consciously manage this process of the aging workforce and all of the different generations that are in the workforce right now, whilst touching on what James spoke about of just the huge influx of things that are happening on a day-to-day basis. So we'd like to introduce ourselves. My name is Nicholas White. I'm the managing director of a boutique consultancy firm in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And we really focus on company culture, engagement, health in the workplace, as well as the environments in which people are working within. So how do we change those things to make things better? That's really our focus. And what we'd like to do today is bring some of our ideas and thoughts to you all to hopefully learn and take some value back. And Antti, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Antti Harjuoja, and now that my last name is quite hard to pronounce for someone. I come from the company called Milestone Coaching and Consulting. We are experts on corporate culture development since 2002, and I'm leading our new service called Nextmile, and we launched like 5 months ago first version of our service focusing on this aging workforce, because we know that in Finland within the next 10 years there will be about 800,000 employees retiring. In Europe the same number is roughly about 65 million, so there is a huge challenge coming from societal, employer and employee point of view.
And funny enough, we actually met each other last year at Upgrade Life, and in that, yeah, we did some of the speed dating where you get to meet people for 15 minutes. And over the last year, we've built a partnership across Finland and the Netherlands to focus on corporate culture and these issues that we're talking about. So it's a really nice opportunity to be here and to talk with you all, but also to just get to know new people. So reach out and we'll always see what happens. We are in uncharted territory. That's really the basics of it. More people than ever are in the workforce, and it's 4 generations. You know, we have baby boomers at the top who are retiring at a very quick rate, or not. That's also a bit of a challenge at the moment. Automation is taking on jobs. That's for another time. I think that's a talk that we could spend a lot of time on. But it is disrupting the way that we work, and everybody, I think all of us in this room are affected by it and are feeling it and concerned about it, and how's it going to look and what's going to happen, what's going to change. Those are all things that happen on a very regular basis in every work. And for the first time, the older generation are living and working longer than ever. It used to be that you became 65 and you were excited to retire, and you would spend the last 5 years of your life just relaxing. But actually people are in a vital place at 65 now. They have energy, they have time, they have money, and they have something still to give. So do they want to retire? So we're in uncharted territory there of not everybody leaves. So what I wanted to do real quick is could all the baby boomers stand up real quick? If we're talking about people born between 1946 and 1964. And it's actually interesting, there's only 3, 4, or 5 people in the room that stand up at this point. I guess they're working. Somebody's got to work. But this is really the largest generation in the workforce right now, and it's also the largest generation that's leaving the workforce in a huge movement of people getting to that age. But these people who were always rewarded for loyalty to the company. They always were given promotions based on time in the company, and it's a really interesting generation because they look at the other generations in a particular way because they grew up in a certain time. How about the Generation Xers, so the people of 1965 to 1980? Okay, a much bigger group. And that's really interesting that you're all here. One of the biggest traits of a Generation Xer is the work-life balance. That was always very important, and the balance of finding other experiences in their lives and being able to explore different avenues. And this was very strange to the baby boomers to see this, because all of a sudden these people were, they had a little bit more flexibility in the way that they work. How about the millennials, the Generation Y? Okay, that's also a very big audience. The Generation Y, the millennials, they're the ones who are really shaking up the workforce, right? Nobody really knows what to do with the Generation Y, and there's tons of focus on them because they demand a lot of focus. But they're the ones who have used technology, and they're actually being rewarded to jump around. They're not being rewarded to stay at the same company and sit tight and wait for the promotion. They're actually being rewarded to jump around. So how do we deal with all of these different generations? Because they all need to be communicated to in a very different way. The baby boomers don't really like feedback, as an example. When it's quiet, they're happy. Whereas the Generation Y, they like direct feedback from their bosses. And the Generation X, they don't necessarily want to hear from their boss, but they want to have outside counsel. At the same time, these baby boomers, they're retiring. And what are we going to do with this huge gap in the market that's coming? So we're going to discover each one of these.
Yeah,
quickly.
so we have 4 generations currently in the workforce, right? Generation Z just entered the workforce, and like you said, we're really in uncharted territory, so we don't know what's going on, I guess, but what is the ripple effect of that then?
Yeah, I think what we see is we have, across the whole spectrum, you have society having pension funds that are completely taxed at this point, where will we have enough to pay for the Generation Y and the Generation Z? Organizations are going to have this huge gap in the workforce. A lot of the baby boomers are the executive level. They are the managers. They are the ones that are leading the boat. So when they leave, what's going to happen? And how are we going to keep these companies moving, and all of the generations below that? How do we keep them motivated, and how do we give them the skills to take over from that next level?
Yeah, I can speak about this aging perspective, that what we have learned, that there's, of course, point of view is inside the office and outside the office. And when it's interesting, like at the moment there's 4 generations in the market working at the same time, and the younger generations and all this development around us, like speed up the working environment, and it's almost all about that, what James was telling us. And those at the office, maybe boomers, the aging workforce, are wondering that everything is so hectic, and what's my value here? Am I worthy? And also the changing is happening outside the office, that the kids are growing up, maybe they already moved out from home, and we are just together with my spouse, and all the big changes are happening.
Yeah, when you retire, what do you? It's completely different. You've been working for 40 years full on, and all of a sudden you're at home looking at each other like, "Hi, how's life now?" I think there's just tons of different dimensions to think about when the workforce changes and these different generations come in. And we didn't really even talk about Generation Z because we don't know what that's going to be like. But this is a generation that was born into technology to the point where their parents were learning about it at the same time as they just had it. So did we control that use of technology? I mean, that's going to be a huge impact into organizations as well. So what are the baby boomers thinking at the moment? I'm going to pose that one to you because Nextmile, you see a lot of this. So
yeah, well, I can answer that. What we have learned during the last year, we've been building this service up. That there's the group of baby boomers is so diverse. There are so many different stories, so to say, and targets. But there's one group who are really waiting to get retired and, in a way, start living their dream life. Then, an other end is that they don't even want to think about the retirement. They're so work career focused, and they will see what just happened. And I think the big group is somewhere between. Some of them when you start to discuss about the topic, they are a little bit scared, afraid. There are big questions and no answers yet. What's going to happen? They're realizing that it's a huge change from working life to retirement, and well, there are so many different stories. And
yeah, and I think what we're seeing from the organizational perspective when we dive into it is that organizations aren't really addressing it. They're not really talking about it. You see that people will get to the age of 65, the company will say, here you go, here's your watch, which they don't even do anymore. And they retire people who maybe are not even ready, but everybody gets the same kind of treatment, thanks for your service, and you move on. At the same time, organizations aren't thinking about succession planning when they think about those baby boomers leaving and the new generation coming in. They look for the right talent, the new generation, and succession planning is looking at the younger generation, but they're not really looking at that transition. How do you learn from the people who just spent 35 to 40 years in your business, producing results, knowing the business, knowing the industry? Why aren't we capitalizing on that talent? Why aren't we capitalizing on the ability to learn from these people? Do you have an answer for that, or should we keep that till the end?
Let's keep it for a while.
Yeah, let's keep it for a while. So then, what about Generation X? How do you see them? What are they thinking at this moment?
Well, Generation X, I think they're a little bit more like, they are still focused on or committed to employer, and they're more like a balancing between working and family, and they're a little bit more purpose-driven and in a way flexibility. They value flexibility in living in general.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of the literature and a lot of what we see in organizations is that Generation X has always been a bit of the lost generation, is what they've called it. The baby boomers required a lot of attention and a lot of focus on them of how to work with them in the workforce, and they've been there for the longest. And Generation Y, because they're so different from Generation X and the baby boomers, that requires a big, oh my, what are we going to do with these people who are not loyal, they jump around, they look for the best opportunity at the best time. And that's not a bad thing, that's just where their motivation factor is. That's where they're being motivated to behave in a certain way. So how do we deal with this all of a sudden very different world that's coming up? So from a Generation X perspective, the focus has been on the baby boomers, and now it's on Generation Y. Well, what would happen to our opportunity, our chance? And that's a really interesting, because they've been waiting for the baby boomers to retire, take on those executive roles, the leadership roles, but maybe they've just felt like that's missed.
Kind of the middle child of the generations.
Exactly.
But we're giving them a lot of attention, which they're not used to, so we should probably move on.
And the Y, how about the Generation Y?
I see it, Generation Y is more like a purpose committed instead of committed to one employer. And you can see it more and more at the moment in the market that maybe more entrepreneurs or freelancers, and they're more committed to do some nice, purposeful, sustainable things, try to achieve, leave a mark, so to say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Generation Y, from an organizational perspective, they're looking for the best technologies, flexible working, being able to work when and how and where they want to work. And they're also, they're a little bit different from Generation X in the sense that they want direct feedback from their managers. They want guidance. They want mentorship. They want to understand, are they doing the right things at the right time for the organization. I think that's a really big distinction. So if you look at baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, and the upcoming Generation Z, they all need to be spoken to in a little bit of a different way. And I think organizations try to speak to all of them, everybody in the same way, and that doesn't necessarily always land correctly. So are organizations ready for this big change that's going to happen when we talk about people retiring, all of these different generations coming through the workforce? What do you think? You want to start?
Yeah, I can start. That's easy answer. 9 out of 10 organizations, they are not ready. What we have learned during last year that it seems that it's already years and years that we have been seeing and in the discussions that we're speaking about the pension time bomb, but still feels that it's a surprise for almost everyone. Let's say 1 out of 10 average, they have prepared something, but looks like most of them are still feeling that, oh shit, we should do something, but what should we do?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're seeing across the board. It's going to happen no matter what. This change is going to happen, and the way that that we look at organizations and the way that organizations treat these things is sometimes they just put their head in the sand, and I think that image is a good one in the sense of, this will take care of itself, people will retire, new generations will come in, and that will happen, but why let it happen in an unstructured, in an uncaring, in a way that doesn't take these people into consideration? What we see is the immense amount of pain that's created when it's not managed deliberately, when it's not actually controlled and these people are supported through this process. So I think it's a sad thing to say that organizations aren't necessarily ready and don't necessarily know how to deal with this from an empathetic perspective. But that's also a huge opportunity. I think we're all part of organizations, we're all part of companies, and to think about it a little bit more empathetically of how do we help people, how do we speak to people, and how do we take them through this process is really, really important. Is society prepared?
That's a great question. And maybe think about that, how should we prepare? And as Nick said, that this mega trend is really happening. All of us, we are aging, and there won't be any surprises on that. So how should we prepare on a society level? Because I feel like it's more, the message, it's more negative that we are prepared or try to prepare the cost of these huge pensions and so on. But I haven't seen any discussion about the opportunities, because every challenge creates opportunity at the same time. And why shouldn't we focus more on that side?
Yeah, and I think what we also see is that there's a huge shift happening in society. I mean, for the Y generations out there, how many of you honestly believe that there will be a pension ready for you when you turn 65?
No hands.
There's not a hand in the audience.
Do the other generations think there will be a pension?
Yeah, how about
generation?
the baby boomers?
Yeah, but for the Y generation, for example, you think it'll be there but for your own generation, any hands?
And that's just fascinating to me, because there's this huge shift happening of movement from society and organizations and structure taking care of the people to people having to learn to take care of themselves. And that huge shift that's happening isn't being really talked about. It's not being communicated. It's the Generation Y, we all know that, or we're concerned that it's not going to be there, but it's also not worrying us too much because we're trying to figure out how to take care of ourselves. And I think that's a really interesting shift that needs to be talked about more. And all of the shifts that we just spoke about, all of those generational changes that are going on, they just need to be talked about more, and they need to be supported, and they need structure within companies to actually address these situations. We can't just put our heads in the sand and say it's going to go away, it's going to take care of itself. We need to take some responsibility as a society and as organizations to take care of each other in this way. So why don't you start by talking about what needs to happen in this regard? How do we support everybody?
Well, I think the first thing is to admit that and face it. This is happening right now, and we can do something about it. As mentioned, that it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And it's a leadership issue, it's a cultural issue, and there are it is in the end come down to individual level and understanding the needs and creating flexible models to tackle this challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it's interesting. The partnership that we created in the last year is all about cultural assessment, cultural management, cultural support. The product is called Mile Drive from Milestone. And it's really taking it down to the individual level of what are the basic human needs that everybody within organizations have, so that we can actually address those human needs and make people feel more comfortable and more secure in their environments. And I think it's really, really interesting because you have a lot of people who are retiring, a lot of people who are waiting for their turn, and there's just no clarity or no transparency or openness about that process. So we think we can solve a lot of these problems by just making managers and leaders and organizations aware of the areas that they do this well and the areas where this can be improved. And next to that, Milestone has also created an amazing product called Nextmile, which takes on the retirement population itself. And I don't know if you want to say some words about it and how it's functioning.
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, that just started and working on first customers and learning that there's an actual need is there, and amazed how many employers are fighting against that. Yes, there are plenty of employees who are reaching retirement age, but not really know what to do or waiting for some kind of guidance from the leadership that what should we do. And one interesting thing what we have learned that there are more and more aging employees that they are healthy, they are wealthy, and they are willing to keep on working with a flexible ways. And I have personally speak many of those retired employees from big corporations that they were willing to continue working with flexible ways, but what their employer offered them was full-time or nothing, and they chose retirement.
I think that's really interesting because one of the things that you could pose as a question is, what happens if we don't retire when we're 60? We have a really healthy population, like you said. The baby boomers are really exercising the use it or lose it. Mm-hmm. And what standards could they set for the rest of us? Living longer, living healthier, being sharper, that kind of thing. And that's what I think is the exciting thing that isn't being talked about when everyone else is waiting for the baby boomers to retire to get their corner office.
And I think it's an open, transparent, and holistic approach that needs to happen, and it needs to be an open dialogue and discussion. Because another element of that is that the baby boomers are sitting at the top of organizations. They've been growing in that organization for a very long time, and their salaries have done that as well. So you're talking about a huge resource that's required to keep somebody who's 65 working. So in a way, there's a discussion there as well of finding balance between maybe less work, turning into a guidance figure, helping coaching the younger generation, but also maybe helping with redistributing some of that resource towards the younger population as well, because these people are waiting for those executive roles and they're waiting for moving up in the organization as well.
Can we get a show of hands on who would be interested in working part-time or in a voluntary capacity after they retire, just theoretically? A couple of people want full-time, but a good raise of hand from the
Yeah,
audience.
that's really interesting. I think that shows in itself that there's a lot of interest in a new approach and a new way of thinking about work after retirement. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I want to close with just a question because I think it's interesting. But what happens, we've talked about the human component of this. What happens if we don't address this problem? What's the worst case scenario?
That's a great
Go
question.
dark. Go really dark.
Go really dark. I think that's a great question, but I think there's a lot of that already, and I think it's the pain that comes to individuals when there's uncertainty, unclarity, that there's a lack of transparency or goal or vision of where they're going. And our minds in themselves go to the darkest place when we don't have all the information. So when we don't give people an opportunity to discuss this openly or have the information to understand what's going to happen, then they automatically take themselves into a dark place. And we see that in all transformation projects across the board, that if it's not consciously and openly and transparently managed, there's just a ton of pain.
Yeah.
And that's what we hope to mitigate and avoid for the future, to really try and create that openness and transparency and discussion, dialogue.
Well, briefly, I can see that, for example, we have a customer that, especially in some fields of businesses, like a business critical knowledge is retiring. And if you take over that and early enough start to prepare the knowledge transformation, you are in big trouble.
I think it could be a huge problem. The us versus them is always dangerous in business, and I think our generations were very in our generation as well, so it could do a benefit or a huge problem. Do we have any questions in the audience? Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. You're discussing these generations, baby boomers, etc. What about, are they relevant when the labor market is becoming more and more multicultural? So there are other dimensions than these generations in the labor market. As for instance, internationalization and the multicultural labor market and organization. How do they affect the idea of the generations?
Yeah. Do you want to take it or do you want me
You
to?
can start.
So I think the generations is very much based on when people were born, and there's a lot of traits within that process. But of course, what you're talking about is a huge impact as well. And I think the question just leads to the conclusion that the work environment that we work in is extremely complex. There's just a lot of different things going on. There's a lot of emotions. There's a lot of age traits. There's a lot of cultural traits. And the only way to navigate those as an organization is to be open about them and to really discuss them in a way that doesn't put your head in the sand to ignore them, you know. And what we do a lot of is listening to all of the different stakeholders that are impacted by a change, and only when you have everyone's view can you come with a solution that actually makes sense. And we come from a time where top-down was always the solution. The managers or the leaders were the ones who decided how it was going. And I think that there's a huge benefit in actually doing a more holistic 360-degree approach to these changes, which would then bring in the cultural element as well.
One last question? Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah.
Enjoy
Thank
the
you.
rest of the day.
Yeah.